The bill before us today would establish a new state office with a goal, as published by the nonpartisan fiscal agency, to coordinate efforts related to its mission of assisting workers and communities during the state's renewable energy transition. The office would also be required to submit a transition plan to the legislature by the end of 2025. Also, the bill defines a transition-impacted industry to be fossil fuel energy workers, internal combustion engine workers, workers in the building and construction trades, and anyone else the masters of the universe deem appropriate. We must ask ourselves what the purpose of this legislation is, why its advocates think it's necessary. To answer that question, we cannot look at this legislation today in isolation. It must be put into context with other missteps the majority of this legislature is taking. For instance, the two crown jewels of their directed economy, the 100% mandate of carbon neutral energy and billions of taxpayer-funded incentives to force a shift to electric vehicles. This bill before us today is a recognition that these government-forced and coerced actions will have a negative impact on Michigan jobs. These new jobs may be fewer in number and pay less than the old ones. This is the value proposition of a benevolent centralized planner. Your livelihood and ability to support your family will need to be sacrificed, but don't worry, it's for the greater good. A good, of course, that is determined by the centralized planner's own value judgment and will be crammed down upon everyone, whether the people want it or not. It would be more fitting to rename this so-called proposed office of Community and Worker Economic Transition Office to the Ministry of Forced Economic Transition and State-Mandated Unemployment. I have heard supporters of this legislation say many times that this office is needed because market forces are moving us toward renewable energy and electric vehicles. I acknowledge there are some natural market movements in this direction, but these natural market-driven movements pale in comparison to the government actions and mandates, both at the state and federal levels. To an overwhelming extent, this is a government-created market. The government is actively trying to force this transition through centralized planning and mandates. And what will the impact be on the economy? What's going to happen to Michigan workers and families who are dependent on jobs in the automotive and energy industries? The answer lies in this very legislation. This bill before us today talks about replacing lost income and gaps in income, and replacing lost tax-based revenue, as if they are inevitable consequences of the forced transitioned state governments want to interject upon the people of the state of Michigan. The original version of this bill even called for something called a wage benefit differential and set up a specific fund for the so-called transition. The legislation before us may have gone from terrible to just bad with the changes, but it still puts our state on a very dangerous path with a very dangerous role for government. Why would we as a state intentionally force policies expected to result in lost jobs and lower wages for workers? It doesn't make sense, but that's what the Democrat-controlled legislature has done time after time this year. Case in point is repealing our right-to-work law. At a minimum, and this is being charitable, this bill needlessly grows state government and endorses government interference with the economy and our livelihoods. It hints at centralized planning and forced market mandates that have failed so spectacularly in the past in virtually every nation that has attempted them. Any movement toward electric vehicles and renewable energy should be allowed to take place more naturally and in sync with the broader economy. These changes should not be forced. It is one thing for natural market forces to dictate changes in employment trends. But it's another thing entirely for a government to mandate these transitions, particularly within tight time frames. It would make the energy grid even more unreliable than it already is and make our utility bills even higher than they already are. It would eliminate jobs and raise costs at the same time. We are at great risk of relying on technologies that are not ready, and the consequences might have significant impacts. This bill symbolizes a monumental divergence of political philosophy between those who advocate for a planned economy and those who advocate for free markets. As Hayek argued in The Road to Serfdom, centralized planning may have nobly stated ends, such as social justice, equality, or security, but the means used to implement these ends, which is of great concern. Hayek stated, "In this sense, socialism means the abolition of private enterprise, of private ownership of the means of production, and the creation of a planned economy in which the entrepreneur working for profit is replaced by a centralized planning body." The danger proposed is that there is a correlation between how free markets work and the degree of freedom which is given in a society. In a planned economy, competition is substituted with coercion. This coercion does not limit itself to the economic side of life. For a centralized plan to be enacted, individual liberties need to be limited. The link between planned economies, which were driven by authoritarian governments, is glaringly obvious from the early 20th century up to today. I would have thought the examples were self-evident, but this leads me to think that they are not. So I will list a few examples. The former Soviet Russia and any poor country behind the Iron Curtain, North Korea, China, Vietnam, Cambodia, Cuba, Venezuela. What do all these countries have in common? They relied on a supposedly benevolent planner to run their economy, which resulted in poverty, loss of liberty, and untold suffering. Centralized planning is simply inefficient because markets are too complex. It is impossible for a planning board of a handful of members or even one person to fully understand what will actually work across a whole society. On the other hand, a free economy allows for individuals to determine production through competition, which is moderated through market-driven pricing. Most importantly, this type of free economic system not only generates prosperity, but opportunity, and it supports a free society as well. The divergence is stark, and anyone who would be foolish enough to support servitude and poverty over freedom and prosperity is beyond me. To sum it up, this legislation goes beyond what the scope of government should be. It supports centralized planning and the road to serfdom, and I urge a no vote.